If there was one thing that was going to tempt moviegoers into cinemas for some mid-budget vampire action in 2003, it was probably Bill Nighy as a vampire overlord. Or was it a marketing campaign featuring a leather-clad Kate Beckinsale? I'll let you decide. The early noughties had already brought some decent vampire action before we were subjected to the shimmering embarrassment to the genre that was the Twilight Saga. We were also just a few short years away from seeing some proper kick-ass, sexy vampire action on the small screen with HBO's excellent True Blood series. The vampire genre was starting to show some signs of a reawakening, and films such as the fun but flawed Queen of the Damned from 2002, Ginger Snaps from 2000, and, of course, the awesome Blade series were leading the blood-sucking way. Vampires have always been a popular form of escapism for audiences, and they're still massively popular now. There's something timeless and fascinating about the mythical creatures, and whether it's a classic such as 1922's Nosferatu, Tom Cruise wearing platforms in Interview with a Vampire, or the hilarious movie and TV show What We Do in the Shadows, people love them. The movie we're focusing on in today's video may not be the best vampire flick ever made, but it started a hugely popular franchise, plus a video game with Underworld: The Eternal War. So, could the promise of some tight leather and a werewolf versus vampire skirmish be enough to warrant the hype? Let's find out here on What the Happened to Underworld. Vampires and werewolves, not swearwolves, remember?
What are we?
Werewolves, not swearwolves.
Have been fighting for centuries in popular fiction. In fact, do some research and you'll find their origins going all the way back to Slavic historical accounts of the bloodsuckers and hairy Lycans. It wasn't until the Hollywood studios began to realise that pitting vampires and werewolves against each other would appeal to a wide audience. Universal Pictures' Dracula from 1931, starring Bela Lugosi, and 1941's The Wolfman with Lon Chaney Jr. made the monsters enduring archetypes of mainstream horror. It wasn't long then before Universal threw both the characters together on the big screen, admittedly without too much interaction, in House of Frankenstein from 1944, and its pseudo sequel, 1955's House of Dracula. The first movie to actually feature some fangs on fur action was indeed 1948's horror comedy Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Since then, of course, werewolves and vampires can't help but getting it on in popular culture. So by the time Danny McBride wrote the screenplay for Underworld, there was definitely a thirst, pun intended, for the subgenre amongst audiences. Back in 2000, McBride met first-time director Len Wiseman through their agent Nick Reed, and after their first attempt to collaborate faltered, it wasn't long before they found a project to work on together. Actor Kevin Graveau came up with the concept of Underworld, and McBride and Wiseman stepped in to work on the script, with a plan to branch the series out into a trilogy. Unfortunately for the production, controversy was on the moonlit horizon, as the film was the subject of a lawsuit from White Wolf Incorporated and Nancy A. Collins, who claimed that Underworld's setting was too similar to the games Vampire the Masquerade and Werewolf the Apocalypse, plus the Sonya Blue vampire novels. Ultimately, a judge granted White Wolf a hearing, and after thrashing out the messy details, the lawsuit ended in a confidential settlement. With the film's legal woes firmly in the rearview mirror, the production team went full steam ahead on casting the movie, and with a cornucopia of S&M clad vampires and werewolves to throw into the mix, the audition process must have been a lot of fun. Prior to Underworld, Len Wiseman began his career as a property assistant on a number of Roland Emmerich movies, including Stargate, Independence Day, and 1998's much maligned Godzilla. He directed ads for large clients such as Sony, as well as music videos for the likes of Megadeth, Static X, and En Vogue, but Underworld was his debut feature in the hot seat. When it came to casting the movie, Wiseman would not only find his perfect Selene, but also his future ex-wife in Kate Beckinsale. Selene, the main protagonist of the movie, is a death dealer, an elite vampire assassin who hunts down the hairy Lycans in revenge for murdering her family, all while clad in that tight leather and a coat that looks like it was stolen from the set of The Matrix. In fact, everyone looks pretty cool in the movie, but we'll get into the production values a little later in the episode. The other main cast members consist of the aforementioned Bill Nighy as Victor, the second most powerful of the vampire elders, Scott Speedman as a vampire / Lycan hybrid, and love interest of Selene, plus Michael Sheen as Lucien, the elder of the Lycans. We also get Shane Brolly as a vampire noble who plots to kill the elders, plus other roles for the likes of Erwin Leder, Sophia Miles, and Kevin Graveau. The main plot of the movie centres on Beckinsale's death dealer Selene, who begins to fall for Speedman's coven, who is, rather unfortunately, being targeted by those pesky Lycans. When one of them finally mistakes him for a wolf snack, Selene must decide whether to do her duty and kill him, or go against her clan and save him. It really is quite the quandary. The cast, production team and setup are all solid. I still think it holds up pretty well for what it is, flaws and all. The opening sequence of the movie sees Beckinsale's Selene delivering an expositional voiceover in that lovely pithy English accent before an extended action scene kicks in. It's 11 minutes into the movie that we get any proper dialogue, when Michael Sheen's super sexy Lycan Lucien, and try saying that after a couple of True Bloods, makes a super sexy entrance.
You're acting like a pack of rabid dogs!
Not that it matters. Underworld wasn't written with the Best Original Screenplay Oscar in mind. What we get is exactly what you'd expect from its marketing campaign, and it delivers this for its slightly male-skewed audience pretty well. There's no pretty boy heartthrobs with great hair in this franchise, thankfully, and its wide appeal is perhaps due to the Romeo and Juliet with vampires and werewolves premise. The movie may have arrived long after Bela Lugosi and company, but it was still a few years prior to the genre being shimmered into that insufferable, if admittedly hugely profitable, teen romance with Miss Swan. After Selene delivers her opening voiceover about a backstory that never really comes into play, it's clear that the movie isn't going to bother with nuanced character development. We therefore don't really care about the innocent turned monster Michael, or the many fake fang-wearing vamps looking for a werewolf scuffle. To be fair though, the movie stands alone as an action spectacle, with dodgy CGI and set pieces that don't add any real weight to the narrative, but are nonetheless a lot of fun to sit through if you're looking for some daft escapism. It's also perhaps quite noticeable that director Wiseman has more than just a soft spot for Beckinsale, with the actress given numerous glamour shots and close-ups to accentuate her good looks, while Scott Speedman is too busy getting hunted and attacked to look cute, like he did as Ben in Felicity. What I personally like about the movie is the gothic splendour in which director of photography Tony Pierce Roberts lenses it. The script may be severely lacking and the VFX are shoddy at best, but it's a great looking movie otherwise, with probably just enough bite and action to satiate most gothic gorehounds. Underworld premiered at the Grauman's Chinese Theatre in Los Angeles, California on September the 15th, 2003, and was released in the United States on September the 19th by Sony Pictures Releasing. The movie was a surprise hit and grossed over $95 million worldwide against a reported budget of $22 million. It had competition upon release from Secondhand Lions, The Fighting Temptations, and Cold Creek Manor. Other movies already in the marketplace at the time were Cabin Fever, Once Upon a Time in Mexico, and Matchstick Men. So, Underworld was a good example of successful counter-programming. Critically, the movie received generally negative reviews, which was probably to be expected, but Beckinsale's performance, the gothic visuals, and the vampire and werewolf mythology were all mentioned favourably. Empire magazine praised the movie's visuals, but bemoaned some of its casting choices, saying, "Like its heroine, Underworld looks fabulous, but does everything wrong," and adding that, "This is a film that insists characters are charismatic, mysterious, immortal, and impressive," then cast Shane Brolly and Michael Sheen in the roles. Beckinsale hides behind her hairstyle, and when Selene has the idea of waking up the vampire's Dracula figure leader, Bill Nighy looms into the picture in desperate need of witty lines to go with his bizarre presence. Amusingly, it was another aspect of the movie that piqued the curiosity of Entertainment Weekly, who said that, by the end, I was starting to ponder questions like, if a vampire mates with a Lycan vamp hybrid, which parent will have to convert? Ultimately then, Underworld is far from a perfect film, but for this particular writer, that doesn't really matter. The visuals are pretty great, the action's fun, and the costume design is suitably eye-catching. Plus, it launched a hugely successful franchise that was not only profitable enough to keep going, but also kept the franchise firmly in the mainstream eye. More importantly though, as always, your opinion is what matters to us here at JoBlo, so let us know your thoughts of Underworld in the comments section. Does it hold up all these years later, or should it be staked through the heart? I can't wait to hear your thoughts on this one, you wonderful gorehounds. Thanks for watching. Vampires and werewolves are big business in mainstream media, with a veritable feast of TV shows and movies being dedicated to the mythical creatures across the decades. So, when something comes along that slots straight into the mainstream zeitgeist, with its gothic visuals and sexy vampires fighting those pesky werewolves,
What are we? Werewolves, not werewolves.
you know what's coming next. Yup, sequels and prequels. As mentioned in our previous episode that sunk its teeth into the fun but flawed Underworld from 2003, director Len Wiseman found love with his leading lady, Kate Beckinsale. And, if you're being massively cynical, you could perhaps suggest that their starstruck Hollywood romance is one of the main reasons a follow-up to the first movie was greenlit. Or maybe it was the decent box office, cool world building, or maybe even the lashings of S&M clad characters. The first movie, as we discussed previously, is flawed and far from perfect, but you know what? I liked it. Hairy lycan, warts and all. Whatever your view of the movie is, it had a lot going for it. And let's face it, this type of genre flick has gone down the once dreaded straight-to-home video route before. The main selling point is obviously Beckinsale's Selene, with her slow-mo acrobatics, raucous firefights and tight leather costume, and that long overcoat she pilfered from Neo. Director Wiseman obviously thought so, with the endless glamour shots of his partner, whom he married in 2004, but sadly divorced from a number of years later. Sequels are never an easy undertaking, with audience and fan expectation heightened by what's come before. So could the promise of some further world building lead to a follow-up that expands upon the first movie and ups the vampire versus werewolf action significantly? Let's find out here on What the F*** Happened to Underworld Evolution. Let's just take a moment to look at the merits of some vampire and werewolf flicks that showed the world that their impact on mainstream culture was merited and worthy of potential sequels. Or, on the contrary, that should have been staked through the heart and left to slowly decay. Well, don't get me started on the awful Twilight series, and I appreciate how huge the books are and the cultural impact of the franchise as a whole, and at least it introduced a new audience to the mythology of vampires and shapeshifters. But vamps shimmering in the sunlight in a largely bloodless and raunch-free teen-friendly setting is too tame for this particular gorehound. Nope, no thanks. See you later, Bella and friends. Give me the black and white punk vampire western aesthetic of A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, Del Toro's excellent Kronos, or the hilarious hijinks of What We Do in the Shadows, both on the big and small screen over Twilight anytime. But you know what, that's just my own personal opinion, gorehounds. The point is, there's obviously an audience out there for Underworld, and while the merits of the series is subjective to your own personal taste, we can still dissect what works in terms of the follower's narrative, and if it expands upon the mythology sufficiently. The story for Evolution was again written by director Wiseman and Danny McBride, who also wrote the movie's screenplay. In terms of cast, we get the leather-clad Kate Beckinsale back again, naturally, plus Bill Nighy returning in a smaller role this time, which makes sense when you see the movie, even though his head was sliced in two in the first installment. Scott Speedman's Michael also returns, as does Shane Brolly's Craven. The main cast is also joined in this one by the classically trained English Shakespearean actor Derek Jacobi, as the progenitor of both the vampire and werewolf bloodlines, Alexander Cornavus. It's fun seeing the great Jacobi on screen in such an admittedly over-the-top but entertaining genre flick like this. We also get Tony Curran as Marcus Cornavus, Stephen McIntosh as Andreas Tanis, and the returning Zita Gorog as Vampire Elder Emilia. Like the first movie, Evolution boasts a solid cast and talent behind the camera, so could it not only expand upon the mythology, answer some questions about the battle between the vamps and lycans, and deliver some kick-ass bloodthirsty action? Well, it tries to achieve all of these elements, but just doesn't quite manage to stick the slow-mo leather-trousered landing. The blood feud between the two factions continues apace in Wiseman's cranked-up sequel, with more of the expected goth-flavoured sex appeal, blood spillage, and grisly spectacle. The movie opens with a prologue set in a frosty medieval village that's been ravaged by those pesky lycans, who, as we all know by now, are the sworn enemies of the slightly poncy vampire clan. Amongst the corpses littering the streets, just ready to transform, we're introduced to two brothers, Tony Curran's Marcus and William, played mainly by some monstrous CGI. You see, Marcus was bitten by a bat and William by a wolf, which sets us up nicely for a sibling power struggle, which naturally is set against a bleak gothic environment where leather-clad ladies lay waste to beasties with their twin pistols like she's just stepped off the set of a badly lit John Woo movie. The prologue at least rectifies an issue with the first movie in that the vampires and werewolves spend a lot of time shooting at each other while wearing black leather or as a badly rendered CGI beastie, but don't necessarily seem like the classic creatures. The opening scenes of Evolution at least give us a glimpse into their origins, and we also get to see some freshly turned lycans bite some vampire faces off, which is always fun. Once the action switches to the present day, the blood-sucking Marcus emerges from his tomb as one ugly mother with wings he uses to behead his enemies. It's appreciated, because the monsters are at last actually acting like monsters in the series. Meanwhile, the star-crossed lovers, Selene and Michael, are coming to terms with his new status as a hybrid, and the fact that they need to stop Marcus from freeing his lycan brother from his very long entombment. The first act of the movie gives us some pretty decent set pieces, including the truck chase with the winged Marcus in full flight, and climaxes with a sex scene between Selene and Michael. It's been a long time coming, but it sure looks like their body doubles are enjoying themselves at least. The rest of the narrative from this point onwards doesn't get any more complicated other than it would be pretty bad if Marcus freed William from his slumber, as he's also a proper beast himself. Plus, both brothers are direct ancestors of their respective races, and were sired by Derek Jacobi's Alexander Cornelius. What isn't clear though, is how his offspring are able to mutate into super beasts, while Cornelius seems to be stuck in the body of a classic Shakespearean English actor. The movie's tangled plot gets bogged down by concentrating on backstories and age-old motivations, while Beckinsale continues to be the series' selling point, opposite the underwhelming and seemingly emotionless Scott Speedman as Michael. Their relationship is fairly believable, however, and at least they share some decent chemistry at times. The first movie had that uber cool shot of Selene's balletic drop from the roof, and while the sequel attempts to recreate this several times, choppy editing and poorly executed camera angles lessen the impact. To be fair though, the action in the movie is fairly well produced, and as well as the aforementioned truck chase, we also get a fun, if CGI heavy finale, with rampant mutated beasts and a nice bit of rotor blade comeuppance for one particular character. The settings and location work gives the movie the look of any other generic horror or fantasy epics of the time, and while the CGI monsters aren't always convincing, to say the least, you can forgive this to a certain degree due to the film's heightened reality. Probably the most successful use of VFX and character design goes to the winged Marcus, with Curran's menacing performance a highlight of the movie. This sequel is by no way the disaster it could have been, nor is it the evolution, pun intended, the series needed. However, the promise of future installments at the end of the film doesn't elicit the groans it could easily have done, which is something at least.
Let's go.
Underworld Evolution premiered at the Cinerama Dome in Los Angeles on January the 11th, 2006, and was released in the US on January the 20th by Sony Pictures. The movie opened at number 1 at the domestic box office with a haul of $26.9 million over its opening weekend from a total of 3,207 screens. It didn't have much in the way of similar competition at the time, with only torture porn shocker Hostel competing for the same audience, which was in week 3 and had already dropped down to number 10 in the charts. Critically, the movie was, predictably, slated by most reviewers. It has a 17% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, with the site's consensus saying the movie is a visual and oral assault on the senses. This vampire werewolf sequel makes a lot of noise and features a heavy-handed, overly convoluted story. That is, of course, if you take any notice of that particular website. The New York Times were critical of the movie's overall look and also described it as a monotonous barrage of computer-generated fur and fangs. The San Francisco Chronicle were also less than enthused about the colour grade, saying, "You can tell that Underworld Evolution is trying to be an artistic action horror film because every scene is bathed in the colour blue," but then going on to offer some faint praise. It's an admirable attempt to test the boundaries of the genre, but it's confusing and not fun to watch. Ultimately then, Evolution doesn't, well, evolve the series in any major way, but if you take it for what it really is, a formulaic genre flick, it's still a fun watch. It's far from perfect and is light on both characterization and an engrossing narrative, but Beckinsale works the leather well again, and some of the other main cast members bring a decent amount of menace to the proceedings. More importantly though, I'd love to hear about what your opinion is, as that is what matters to us most here at JoBlo. So let us know your thoughts of Underworld Evolution in the comments section. Does it deliver a worthy part 2, or should the franchise have been obliterated by some out-of-control rotor blades? I can't wait to hear your thoughts on this one, you wonderful gorehounds. Thanks for watching. We all love a good old-fashioned forbidden love story, right? Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet has been reconceptualized countless times over the years, from stylish adaptations by Aussie auteurs, traditional period dramas, and with, of all things, gnomes. This is just a drop in the vast ocean of movies that have taken on the Bard's classic tale, and for the third entry in the popular Underworld series, it was time for a flashback to some forbidden lycan and vampire love. The first Underworld movie had a backstory that explained how vampires and werewolves came to be mortal enemies, thanks to a feud that began between Michael Sheen's super sexy lycan, Lucian, and Bill Nighy's Nosferatu vampire, Victor. You see, hairy Lucian had been secretly romancing the fanged bloodsucker's daughter Sonia, played by Doomsday's Rona Mitra, and with that premise, you can probably guess where this threequel is going. The first 2 movies, as were discovered in our previous episodes, are fun if flawed creature features with an abundance of S&M clad characters, some questionable VFX, and world building where the sun doesn't seem to exist anymore, mostly. They help make stars of actors like Kate Beckinsale, and prove popular enough to spawn games, novels, comics, and various other merchandise. It probably did wonders for leather pants sales too. However, as co-creator of the series Len Wiseman stated when Underworld Evolution was released, the vision was always to create a trilogy of movies, with part 3 being a prequel. So could the tantalising prospect of a Romeo and Juliet style history lesson in all things lycan and vampire be enough to carry the weight of fan expectation, and also introduce some memorable new characters? Well, dust off that leather outfit and let's find out here on What the Fuck Happened to Underworld Rise of the Lycans. With Underworld Rise of the Lycans being a prequel to the first 2 movies, this means its main standing point for a lot of fans, i.e. Kate Beckinsale's leather-clad death dealer, is nowhere to be seen. Well, that's not necessarily true. She does, spoiler alert, appear in a brief cameo. But it's a risky strategy to leave your main draw for what is arguably a largely male-skewed franchise on the sidelines. Also, horror prequels haven't always been the slam dunk the studios were hoping for in the past, with various franchises being milked for all their worth in the name of chasing a quick buck. The Exorcist, The Beginning, had the writer of the original 1973 movie saying that watching it was the most humiliating professional experience. Its terrible reviews and paltry box office return against its mid-range budget didn't exactly help matters. Hannibal Rising made the most basic mistake that so many horror prequels do by attempting to make a serial killer sympathetic, while also failing to cast the lead character with an ounce of the charm that the likes of Brian Cox or Anthony Hopkins had in spades. I could also list countless prequels, but I think the point's been made. Well, actually just one more. The 1982's The Thing, itself a remake of course, is rightly considered to be one of the greatest horror movies ever made, so a follow-up of some kind was inevitable. However, Universal's 2011 prequel feels like a hollow, soulless take on the original, with bad VFX and an incredibly dull script. While those movies weren't all missing their key leading character, or actor, their failures can be attributed to lazy writing, and probably the studio's desire to keep their once lucrative IP alive for as long as they could. The issue with creating a prequel to the Underworld series, and let's remember that co-creator Len Wiseman had always envisioned a prequel for Part 3, is that it had to replace the likes of Beckinsale with equally enticing characters. In fact, Wiseman's ideas were already in place a few years before Rise of the Lycans, with a shift towards focusing on those pesky, hairy Lycans, saying, "The third film is going to be a prequel. It will be an origin story, and we find out things we didn't know about Lucian. He'll have a much bigger part in it. It will be about the creation of the races and what started the war. It will be a period piece. The film will also focus for the first time through the Lycans' point of view." On paper at least, the premise was sound. With production going full steam ahead on the prequel, it wasn't just Beckinsale's Selene who would be missing. Her director, and husband at the time, Len Wiseman, was also stepping aside to focus on other projects. He was approached to direct the fourth installment of the Die Hard franchise, 2007's Live Free or Die Hard, but it's not clear if that was the sole reason from vacating the Underworld hot seat. Instead, picking up the reins would be Patrick Tatopoulos, who had designed the creature effects for the first two movies, and would also do so for the prequel. The VFX artist and production designer had only directed a short, plus a couple of music videos for Coolio, prior to Rise of the Lycans, so it was perhaps something of a gamble for both the studio and director. One thing going in his favour though, was that despite some ropey CGI in the first couple of movies, the creature and production design is pretty solid. And although it's sometimes hard to make out the various vampire on werewolf, on hybrid, on human, etc. skirmishes, due to the overly gloomy lensing and eventual colour grade. So, with some cast members leaving the production due to logistics, others would be making a welcome return. Plus, we also get the introduction of new blood to flesh out the narrative. Unless you're Scott Speedman, who seems to have been forcibly ejected from the franchise, probably in super stylish, slow motion, while wearing all black and looking very moody. Back amongst the fangs and swearwolves,
Sorry,
we're werewolves.
Not swearwolves.
What are we?
Werewolves, not swearwolves.
is, as we mentioned earlier, Michael Sheen as Lucian, who was last seen as a corpse on a table, and also in flashbacks, in Underworld Evolution. He plays a major part in the proceedings here, shagging his master's favourite daughter in a hilarious sex scene that takes place on a literal cliff edge, and subsequently being flogged for it when they're eventually rumbled. Legendary English actor Bill Nighy returns, of course, as vampire leader and the Nosferatu-alike Victor, crushing skulls and threatening all and sundry as only Bill Nighy can. Other franchise regulars also appear in Rise, including Shane Brodley as Craven, Kevin Graveau as Reyes, and Stephen McIntosh as Tanis. The main addition to the franchise though is Rona Mitra's Sonia, who tries her best to out-Beckinsale Kate and does a decent job. Pithy English accent and tight costumes both accounted for. If you've seen our previous What the Fuck episodes on the Underworld series, you'll know that I like it, to a certain degree. They're by no means the benchmark all fantasy movies should aspire to, but there's enough bloodshed and action to keep this gorehound relatively satisfied. However, with the promise of the Lycan and vampire backstory being further developed, plus the return of some key characters, could this Selene light installment satiate my on-screen bloodlust? Well, not entirely no, but that doesn't mean I didn't appreciate it for what it ultimately is, a half-decent, enjoyable monster movie. The plot kicks off back when the Lycans are slaves to the vampires and are forced to wear embarrassing collars to stop them from turning into their werewolf form, but are still expected to protect and serve them. Michael Sheen's hairy Lucian is held in higher regard than the rest by Chief Vamp Victor, because he doesn't know he's shagging his favourite daughter at this point, so Lucian enjoys more than just the flesh of his master's offspring than the rest of his kind. This forbidden love is soon exposed, and as the years go by, Lucian plots to break himself and his fellow swearwolves free from the shackles of his blood-sucking oppressors, with the help of Sonya. All of this leads to a conclusion involving a final battle, naturally, that doesn't really go anywhere other than unfolding the narrative to a new beginning. In terms of the cast, both the excellent and always reliable Michael Sheen and Bill Nighy do their best with a threadbare script, the former seemingly enjoying his relationship and slow-mo soppy as folk sex scene with Rona Mitra, while the latter chews up every aspect of the mega gloomy scenery as best he can. Nighy's vast and wonderfully varied CV means he can play this kind of part blindfolded, but he doesn't just pick a nice little paycheck here and turns in a committed and fun performance. Rona Mitra does a good enough job of out-Beckinsaling Kate, but perhaps because of the script or the way her character is written, she comes across a touch wooden at times. She's a very assured actor, so perhaps this is down to a first-time director not quite having the experience to coax a more engaging performance out of her. Still, she shares some decent chemistry with Sheen's Lucian, who himself roars out some rousing speeches which, if you've seen his other work, you'll already know that these are his trademark. What works in the movie's favour is its Dark Ages period setting, with the fantasy elements at the core of the story much better suited to this environment. However, what lets it down is pedestrian direction, some incredibly shoddy CGI, plus an overly dark colour grade which means you can barely tell which hairy beastie is fighting who most of the time. Also, despite Sheen's gravitas, his speeches are cheesy as fuck and the tired cliches of the love affair at the centre of the story all too familiar. Secret rendezvous, being rumbled by your dad biting your neck, sex on a cliff top with dodgy music, and little flesh on display. You know, the usual stuff. Underworld Rise of the Lycans opened in 2,942 US theatres on January the 23rd, 2009, and grossed an estimated $8 million over its opening weekend. Despite opening at number 1 at the US box office, it was overtaken over the 3-day weekend by the, quote, hilarious, unquote, Paul Blart Mall Cop. It really wasn't a stellar weekend at the cinema, unless you find the likes of Hotel for Dogs the pinnacle of cinema excellence. At least the superb Slumdog Millionaire was still clinging on to a very respectable box office haul nationwide and overseas. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Rise was met with a less than favourable reception from critics, with both claws and fangs out in equal measure. Empire magazine were not impressed, saying, "It's unlikely you'll be able to follow the tosh this passes off as a plot. In former effects man Patrick Tatopoulos' vision, these Dark Ages were really dark, so dark in fact, you can barely see the monster action or register why Sheen and Nighy felt the need to sign up." The movie holds an approval rating of 30% based on 77 reviews, with an average rating of 4.40 out of 10 over at Rotten Tomatoes, while Entertainment Weekly amusingly described the film as basically Where Spartacus, though that makes the humourless, scare-free result sound much more fun than it is. To be fair though, the movie's better than what those particular naysayers have said, and at least Variety saw some merit in the hairy shenanigans, saying that director Patrick Tatopoulos offers a satisfyingly exciting monster rally that often plays like a period swashbuckler, and that the film is notably less frenetic and appreciably more coherent than its predecessors. The Underworld series was never going to go down well with critics, but the fact that it had already spawned 3 movies says that its key demographic was still talking with their wallets enough for the series to continue. And continue further it indeed did, as we may just be taking a look at what delights followed Rise of the Lycans. More importantly though, I'd love to hear about what your opinion is, as that is what matters to us most here at JoBlo. So let us know your thoughts of Underworld Rise of the Lycans in the comments section. Does it soften the blow of not featuring Beckinsale's leather-clad Selene? Well, apart from that small cameo, of course. Or was making it a prequel a bad idea? When you've reached part 3 in a movie franchise and you've realised that making it a prequel and that dropping the main selling point may have affected your box office, what do? Make more hairy swearwolf and vampire movies, of course. That's exactly what you should do. I mean, it's a tactic that's been going on for years in Hollywood, to rinse a known and existing IP for all it's worth, in the name of making a quick buck. Usually, in a desperate attempt to satiate fans of certain characters or franchises, and often at the expense of a decent story, sadly. Just look at the Die Hard and Terminator franchises. The first 3 Die Hard movies are great, and showcase the trials and tribulations of Bruce Willis's weary, wisecracking cop perfectly. Then, the series lost its way, and sadly due to Willis's unfortunate health issues, the franchise won't be seeing the legendary actor returning to it. Unless AI has its nefarious way, that is. The Terminator series should have been crushed in a factory press after the second movie, in my opinion, but alas we keep getting movies that attempt to recapture the magic of the early installments but end up being a poor imitation of a once great series. Also, don't get me started on what Disney has done to Star Wars. Jar Jar Binks isn't looking too bad now, is he? Which brings us back nicely to the massively fun, if flawed, Underworld series. These movies are hugely popular, and for good reason. But is the series becoming like one of those other franchises that should have been staked through the heart by this point? Horror-wise, there are countless franchises that have attempted to continue a series as best they can. But unfortunately, each entry feels like the production team are desperately picking scraps out of what may have previously worked so well. The Halloween franchise has had some amazing entries, and the first installment is an all-time classic, but it's also spat out some duds. You can also add the Friday the 13th, Saw, Texas Chainsaw, and Elm Street franchises as further examples. Don't you dare criticise the Critters series, mind, they're all awesome. Well, okay, they're all mostly awesome, for various reasons. So, with the return of everyone's favourite death dealer, Selene, and with it being a direct sequel to 2006's Underworld Evolution, can the 4th entry in the series buck the trend of diminishing returns? Well, dust off your leather pants and get ready to kick some werewolf butt, probably in slow-mo, here on What the F*** Happened to Underworld Awakening. If you've kept up to date with our series on Underworld, you'll know that I dig these movies, warts and all. Of course, they're not masterpieces of evolutionary filmmaking, but they're simply fun escapism, with a healthy dose of S&M based action and terrible CGI thrown in for good measure. Plus, the fact that we're talking about the 4th entry in the series means that the inbuilt fan base have once again invested enough time and their hard-earned dollar to help keep the franchise afloat. Underworld Rise of the Lycans suffered a little due to Rona Mitra not being able to out-Beckinsale Kate, plus a less than engaging narrative, and some terrible VFX letting it down. The action was at least fun, and it featured a hilarious sex scene on a cliff edge. Plus, the Dark Ages period setting was a great fit for the fantastical shenanigans on display. Also, Bill Nighy was great, which, let's face it, is no big surprise. It seems that the studio weren't just content with having the acrobatic Selene very much back in black for this latest entry in the Werewolves vs Vampires face-off, because they also had another trick up their greedy sleeves. That's right, gorehounds, despite the format being very much an expensive gimmick most of the time, Underworld Awakening was released in glorious 3D, alongside its traditional 2D format. The industry was in the middle of the conversion from 35mm to digital projection, and, as I remember well, being part of that transition here in the UK, it meant that 3D post-converted movies were all the rage, for better and for worse. As we all know, Avatar was designed with 3D in mind, each scene carefully crafted to make the most of the polarizing format. The film isn't looked back on as fondly as other movies in the director's back catalogue, such as Aliens and The Terminator for example, but its massive success led to studios like Warner Brothers bolting on the 3D effect to existing movies, which looked horrendous. However, Awakening was one of the first movies to be shot using the Red Epic digital cameras, so at least the production was thinking laterally about how the format could be used to enhance the cinema experience. We'll take a closer look into the reception of the movie and its 3D elements a little later on in the video. The use of 3D in cinema has noticeably declined in recent times due to several reasons: audience fatigue, poor quality conversions, limited creativity, technical limitations, streaming and on-demand services, plus the considerable costs involved in making 3D movies. Avatar and its upcoming sequels may buck this trend again, because blue cats in space seem to be a huge draw for audiences still. The 4th movie in the popular and polarizing Underworld franchise had been in development since 2009, when Len Wiseman first came up with a story for the movie. It was also supposed to be the first original sequel in the series, as the first two movies began as one long script. Awakening's script went through several versions between 2009 and 2011 by various writers, until a version by one of the credited writers, Michael Straczynski, wrote his version in 2010, just as Beckinsale came back on board. Wiseman also contributed and made changes to the script, and by the time the film went into production, it did so without a finished script, which, horror fans, is never a good sign. In March 2011, production began on the movie at Simon Fraser University in the lovely Vancouver, British Columbia. With the script having undergone several changes, a lot of the initial promotional material was based upon earlier storylines, which meant that Auntie Jen was originally called Biacom, Selene's incarceration was for 15 years instead of 12, plus her daughter in the movie was originally called Nissa and was 14 instead of 11 years old. Also, the title of the movie went through several different iterations before Awakening was settled on, with both Underworld New Dawn and Underworld New Moon thankfully jettisoned. On direction duties this time were Swedish filmmakers and screenwriters Mans Marland and Bjorn Stein. Their previous work where they collaborated as directors includes the awesomely titled short Disco Kung Fu, TV shows SPUNG and Snaphana, plus movies Storm from 2005 and Shelter from 2010. They're also well known as writers on 2016's Midnight Sun, The Bridge from 2016, with Marland also writing Swoon from 2019. They obviously had a lot of history of working together, but found that the various script rewrites had an effect on the production, with the pair not overly clear on what the tone of the movie should be. They said in interviews that nobody was, quote, super happy, unquote, with the script, and its constant changes throughout production saw the tone going from humorous and wink-wink irony to being more serious like the original films. Len Wiseman was apparently often called in for a last-minute rewrite on a scene the day before it was due to be filmed. This was a constant theme throughout production, leading to confusion for all concerned when the cameras began rolling. Despite the production being problematic, at least the film had its original death dealer, Selene, back in her leather outfit, and also seemingly unwilling to give Trinity her coat back anytime soon. Joining her as part of the principal cast members are India Isley as Eve, the hybrid daughter of Selene and Michael Corvin, who only appears in archive footage, plus one scene where it's a body double awkwardly sitting in for the absent Scott Speedman. We also get some acting gravitas in the form of the Lannister Boo-Hearst bad guy himself, Charles Dance, as Vampire Thomas, who really is far too good an actor to be picking up a handy paycheck in these movies. Playing his son David is Divergent star Theo James, whose career has been on the ascendancy ever since. Michael Ealy is Detective Sebastian, Stephen Ray is Dr. Jacob Lane, Sandrine Holt plays Leda, Chris Holden-Reed is Quint, a super lycan and son of Dr. Lane. We also get appearances from Robert Lawrenson, plus an uncredited part for Wes Bentley as one of the antigen scientists. The plot of Underworld Awakening is pretty straightforward. Human forces have cottoned on to the existence of the vampire and swearwolves clans, and decide that the warring S&M-clad factions must be wiped out by any means necessary, thus resulting in an all-out war to eradicate both species. On hand to save the day, however, is the returning death dealer and new mum, Selene, who leads the battle against humankind by delivering clunky dialogue in that lovely plummy English accent, while also attempting to save her superpowered daughter Eve from the hands of Auntie Jen's nefarious scientists. You see, Dr. Lane would really like to perfect the Lycan race. I mean, they probably swear too much for his liking, and needs Eve's super hybrid DNA in order to do so. The movie opens with a "previously on Underworld" montage where Selene narrates over a bunch of action scenes before it delves into how she was captured, plus the vampire/Lycan monster that she's in love with. To be fair, it's a decent opening sequence, and if you're not familiar with the Underworld series, it catches you right up. The vampires and swearwolves have been driven underground, an evil organisation, Auntie Jen, seems to be doing something pretty dodgy with the frozen bodies of Selene and Scott Speedman's body double. Eve is the unfortunate guinea pig at the centre of these experiments, and once Selene escapes, after being frozen for 12 years, then discovers she has a daughter, she's pretty pissed off. Unfortunately, or I guess that should be fortunately, I never had the opportunity to see Underworld Awakening in 3D when it was first released in cinemas, and judging by the various reports on the 3D version, I'm not missing out. The movie is, admittedly, a decent action flick, and although the CGI is once again pretty bad, there's still some fun to be had with the gore on display. Directors Marland and Stein clearly know how to move the camera around, and for an adult fantasy flick like this, it's good to see so much claret being sprayed around on screen, even if a lot of it is a dodgy CGI effect. The movie's performances are fine, because nobody has anything much to do other than look good in leather and kill things, which is the series' hallmark to be fair. Beckinsale looks great as usual, and her on-screen daughter is enough of a Selene-like prodigy to make her introduction to the series worthwhile. Letting the movie down is the troubled scriptwriting process and basic plot. Kid goes missing, people search for the kid, bad people get in the way, loads of killing ensues. Rinse and repeat. It's overly simple and doesn't really add anything new or revolutionary to the franchise. But you know what? I had a good time revisiting the movie again, and it's always nice to see a super Lycan blown to smithereens by a grenade. Underworld Awakening opened at number 1 at the domestic box office, grossing $24 million over the weekend of January the 20th to the 22nd in 2012. It didn't have too much competition for its male-skewed demographic, with only the likes of Red Tails, Contraband, and Disney nemesis Gina Carano's Action a Haywire in its way. It eventually grossed $62 million in North America and another $97 million overseas, bringing a worldwide total of $160 million, making it the highest grossing film in the franchise. Critically, the movie was unsurprisingly met with disdain by critics who clearly need to lighten up. On Rotten Tomatoes, the movie currently has a score of 25% against 77 reviews, with an approval rating of 4.2 out of 10. Empire magazine gave the film a 2 stars review, saying that the movie is not a complete disaster, but also not the vampire/werewolf mash we've always wanted. Den of Geek were more fair in their appraisal of the film, saying that, as action movies go, it was pretty good. The Underworld series seems to have improved with this particular outing, especially compared to the first of the 4 way back in 2003. It may not be the smartest movie at the multiplex, but it's perfectly acceptable, mindless entertainment. Ultimately, I think that sums the movie up pretty well. The franchise is certainly polarising, but if you can see past its flaws, there's a lot to admire. More importantly though, I'd love to hear about what your opinion is, as that is what matters to us most here at JoBlo. So let us know your thoughts of Underworld Awakening in the comment section. Does the return of Beckinsale's leather-clad Selene resurrect your interest in the franchise, or does it suffer the often diminishing returns of sequelitis? I can't wait to hear your thoughts on this one, you wonderful gorehounds, and we'll see you again for more S&M clad vampire and swearwolf action very soon. Thanks for watching. By this point in the evolution of the Underworld series, there's one aspect of it that has never changed. You know exactly what you're gonna get. If you've seen the other movies in this wonderfully daft S&M clad fantasy epic, replete with dodgy CGI, slow-mo death dealers, and cliff-top sex scenes, you may be expecting Part 5 to take some risks and buck the trend. Of course, you'd be sorely mistaken, as not only does Blood Wars tick all of the boxes that the franchise is known for, swearwolves fighting vampires? Yep. More leather than an 80s Judas Priest show? Highly stylized gunfights? Oh yeah. A nuanced, carefully crafted narrative? Don't be daft. The series is unashamed in just how generic it's become, and for this particular gorehound, that's just fine. If some fans may have checked out, the success of Part 4, Awakening, meant that diving back into the franchise, probably in slow motion, would be intriguing. To be fair, if you haven't seen any of the previous movies in the Underworld series, and remember, we're up to Part 5 with Blood Wars, it's unlikely you'd be starting with this one. In fact, only hardcore fans of the series will be keeping track of just how many installments there've been. And if you cut scenes together from all 5 films, it would be hard to tell which scene came from which exact movie, unless you're a hardcore fan. This isn't necessarily criticism, it's just indicative of how the series has refused to grow beyond the basic elements that make up its DNA. The movies so far have all been bathed in that murky, dark, gloomy, brooding colour grade, with the action sometimes hard to decipher. But why mess with a formula that keeps the studio profitable? The age-old tale of werewolves versus vampires has evolved to a certain degree across the franchise, and while the series never shifts from its very serious tone, what exactly do we have in store for Part 5? If you've seen our last video on Underworld Awakening, you'll know that the film begins with an expositional voiceover that catches fans right up with the events of the series up until that point. Plus, the movie introduced some potential fan favourite characters to the roster of monsters and mayhem. So does Blood Wars embrace these additions and bring something even vaguely new to the blood-soaked carnage? Well, inform Trinity that she won't be getting that leather overcoat back anytime soon, as we find out here on what the happened to Underworld Blood Wars.
It's fortunate that we're not forced to rely on your skills for our survival. That is my area of expertise.
I think you should.
Don't think, Farker, you'll hurt yourself.
A franchise such as Underworld either lives or dies a slow death by virtue of its audience staying engaged with the series' progression. And seeing that we're up to the 5th movie, the number crunchers at the studio must have still had faith in its profitability. In a lot of ways, the franchise shares similarities with the also flawed but hugely popular Resident Evil franchise, itself an adaptation of the huge video game series, of course. Both feature badass female protagonists, replete with memorable costumes, and feature badly rendered but glorious death and destruction. Plus, they're both examples of the sci-fi / horror / fantasy genres that seem to be ongoing despite negative reviews and somewhat diminishing returns. What both franchises really boil down to in terms of piquing the audience's attention is their female warriors. Thanks to the T-Virus, Alice's increased agility, strength, and also some unexpected psychic abilities, all the while battling hordes of the undead for a prolonged amount of time. The extra backstory afforded to Selene in the Underworld series may give her an edge if you were to pit them against each other, face-off style. However, the series have evolved together, so their similarities add an interesting dimension to their overall successes, or failures. There's a 4-year gap between the release of the 4th entry, Underworld Awakening, and Blood Wars, so the production process and decision to dive back into the world of werewolves and vampires wasn't necessarily straightforward. Back in August 2017, production company Lakeshore Entertainment announced plans to develop a reboot of the Underworld franchise, and hired Corey Goodman to write the script for the first movie. However, the idea to reboot the series was shelved, and it was ultimately decided that the movie would be Part 5 instead. The original title was Underworld Next Generation, which sounds a little too much like another huge sci-fi franchise to me, and went into production in 2015. Director of the first 2 movies, Len Wiseman, announced that Kate Beckinsale would be returning as Death Dealer Selene, and with his commitments to various TV projects, he took on producer duties on Part 5, along with Tom Rosenberg, Gary Lucchese, and Richard Wright. With the director's chair up for grabs for this one, the production approached German-born American cinematographer and director Anna Forster, who was previously best known for her collaborations with Roland Emmerich. Forster's work as director was mainly on shows like 2014's Outlander and Madam Secretary from 2015. So trusting a mid-budget theatrical release to a first-time feature director was perhaps a risky move for the studio. Having said that, there was nothing overly memorable or outstanding by the series' previous talent in charge, so maybe it was time to get some fresh ideas for the badly rendered carnage on screen. The movie's cast features several returning franchise regulars, plus some new additions to the roster. Of course, good old plummy-voiced English Rose Kate Beckinsale is back as everyone's favourite leather-clad Death Dealer Selene. She even gets a funky new hairdo during a trip to the afterlife, which I guess would be on most people's to-do lists in that scenario, right? Also returning is the swooning Theo James as vampire hybrid and Selene's protege, David, the wonderful Charles Dance, who thankfully doesn't get shot while taking a dump, as vampire elder and David's father, Thomas. Also, no offense intended to anyone with those lovely names, but in a franchise that looks like an outtake from a leather-clad Caligula at times, you'd think the characters would have more exotic names than Thomas and David. One interesting omission from the film is India Isley, who played Selene and Michael's daughter Eve, who only appears in archive footage from Underworld Awakening, and also by a stand-in in this entry. Joining the cast are the likes of Laura Pulver as a feisty vampire, Tobias Menzies as a Lycan leader, Daisy Head as Marius's lover Alexia, Bradley James as another death dealer, plus James Falconer as Cassius.
Welcome.
Am I?
To mark the safe arrival of our guests, I've arranged a little soiree.
There's really no need, thank you.
There's always a need to indulge in pleasure.
Just in case 4 years is too long for fans to remember the hairy swearwolf versus vampire shenanigans from the previous movies, we're treated to a handy narration by Selene that explains the events of both Evolution and Awakening. Yet again, it sets us up for the events in the movie. But by this point, there really hasn't been the plot machinations of something as sprawling as, say, Game of Thrones, for example, so it's not really that useful. Also, when Selene exclaims that,
I have lived beyond my time.
you could also direct that assertion to this franchise as a whole. I've enjoyed the series so far, hairy swearwolf warts and all, but for me there was nothing new or fresh in this installment, other than some nice gore and set pieces that feel like they were inspired by playing hours of Mortal Kombat. The plot of the movie basically sees Beckinsale's leather catsuit-clad heroine battle to end the eternal war between those hairy swearwolves and the dashing vampires that betrayed her. Blood Wars essentially picks up where the previous installment left off, with the vampire Selene being hunted by both Lycans and vampires alike. Despite her efforts to stay hidden, Selene is drawn back into the conflict when she learns that the Lycans are searching for her daughter Eve, who possesses the pure blood of both vampire and Lycan. The series as a whole has always taken the events at the centre of the narrative very seriously, and Blood Wars is no exception. There's no such levity in proceedings here, and why would there be? However, with so many ideas thrown at the screen in its mercifully short 1 hour and 31 minute runtime, it demands that returning fans lap up the mythology again and hope that newcomers are invested enough to care. Another issue with the series thus far has been the one-dimensional and thinly written character development, with everyone in this entry displaying no more than one personality trait. Honestly, they're all so serious, it's like they're stuck in a desperate eternal struggle for their lives or something.
The Lycans are moving again. No, this is different. They're organized. They have a new leader. His name is Marius.
I'm finished with this war.
Well, it's not finished with you.
With all that being said, was anybody really expecting the 5th entry in a series that prides itself on delivering S&M-clad slow-mo action that's all style and little substance to be any different? Of course not. Underworld has always primarily been about Selene, at least for this gorehound, and I dug some of the over-the-top action in Blood Wars, especially a nice scene where someone has their spine ripped out. So, if you haven't had a chance to check the movie out, or you feel like revisiting it again, why not give it another shot to see if it adds up to more than the sum of its underwritten parts?
Impressive.
Underworld Blood Wars opened in several overseas territories before its domestic release in early January 2017. The movie grossed $30.4 million in the United States and Canada and $50.7 million in other territories, for a worldwide total of $81.1 million against a budget of $35 million. It opened in a marketplace where its main competition was limited to Star Wars Rogue One, which was in week 4, but still, naturally, grossing more than Blood Wars at that point. Critically, the movie was largely panned upon release. The film holds a 21% approval rating on the review aggregator website Rotten Tomatoes, based on 97 reviews, with an average rating of 3.4 out of 10. The site's critical consensus reads, Underworld Blood Wars delivers another round of the stylized violence that the series is known for, but, like many 5th franchise installments, offers precious little of interest to the unconverted. The New York Times wrote that the film was so heavy with exposition, that the director and screenwriter were making a dissertation instead of a sequel, and criticised what he saw as the film's almost willful lack of fun. The Hollywood Reporter also criticised the movie, especially the appearance of veteran actors, saying that the presence of Charles Dance continued the tradition of distinguished British actors appearing in Hollywood crap in lieu of receiving a proper pension. Harsh, but probably fair to be honest. This reminds me of when Michael Caine admitted that at least Jaws 3 helped buy his mum a house. Variety were more kind in their appraisal, calling the movie gun blazing, body splattering business as usual. Which, I guess to be fair, it ultimately is. However, as usual, I'd like to know what your opinion is of the movie, as that is what matters to us most here at JoBlo. Part 5s in any movie franchise are always a tough sell, but does Blood Wars at least continue the tradition of the fun but flawed S&M clad antics of previous entries? Or should it have its spine ripped out, never to see the gloomy light of day ever again? There's been rumours of more sequels being in development, and Beckinsale has also never completely ruled out a return to that leather catsuit. But should it happen? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and as always, thanks for watching, you wonderful gorehounds.
Thank you for clicking on our video, everybody. If you like what you saw here, please make sure you like the video and subscribe and share with your friends who like this sort of content. JoBlo was created by movie fans for movie fans, and we appreciate your support.